Get out of the kitchen, Dad. You're embarrassing us. My son-in-law said it quietly, almost casually, the way you'd ask someone to move their car. He didn't even look up from his phone. I was standing in my own kitchen, in the house I'd owned for 23 years, holding a casserole dish I'd just pulled from the oven with my arthritic hands. Our Thanksgiving guests were arriving in 40 minutes. I had been cooking since 6 in the morning. I set the dish down slowly. My daughter was arranging flowers at the counter 3 feet away. She didn't say a word. I walked out of my own kitchen and stood in the hallway, and something shifted inside me that day. Not broke. Shifted, like a foundation settling after too much weight for too long. Before I tell you what happened next, let me go back 3 years. Because that's where this really starts. My wife Elaine passed in the spring of 2020. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was 61. I was 63. We'd built everything together. 34 years of marriage, a house in Oakville, Ontario, a life that felt solid and earned. After she was gone, the house felt like a museum. Every room had her in it somewhere. Her reading glasses on the side table. Her handwriting on the grocery list still stuck to the fridge. I couldn't take it down for 6 months. My daughter called in October of that year. She'd been living in Calgary with her husband. I'll call him my son-in-law throughout, because that's the only title he ever really used when it suited him. His company, a small residential renovation business, had taken on too many projects and too much debt. COVID had dried up his contracts. They were behind on rent. Could they come stay with me? Just a few months, Dad. Just until we figure it out. Come home, I told her. Stay as long as you need. They arrived in November with a 7-year-old son, my grandson Theo, and more luggage than I expected. My son-in-law shook my hand at the door. His grip was firm the way men's grips are firm when they want you to believe something about them. He looked around at the house, at the oak floors and the updated kitchen and the finished basement, and I saw something register behind his eyes. Appreciation, I thought then. I understand now, it was calculation. The first 3 months were fine. Theo was a joy. He followed me around the garage while I worked on small repairs, asking questions about everything. My daughter cooked sometimes, cleaned sometimes. We adjusted to each other. My son-in-law was job hunting, or said he was. By spring, I noticed the job hunting had slowed. By summer, it had stopped. He'd started a new company, he said. Smaller scale. Working from home. This required a dedicated office, which meant the guest room I'd set up for visitors needed to be converted. I moved my late wife's sewing table to the basement. I didn't say anything. By the end of year 1, I had paid $28,000 in documented expenses. I know the number exactly because I'm a retired chartered accountant. 40 years of tracking figures doesn't leave you when you retire. I kept a ledger in my filing cabinet, not because I planned to use it, just because that's how my brain is built. The $28,000 was the direct cash, a check I wrote when their Calgary landlord threatened legal action over unpaid rent they hadn't told me about. Another when my son-in-law's old renovation business sent a collections notice. The rest was quieter, utility costs that tripled, grocery bills that doubled, my internet plan upgraded to handle his work-from-home needs, Theo's hockey equipment that they couldn't quite manage that season. I also paid their income taxes in year 2, $9,400. They filed jointly. My son-in-law brought me the printout without much explanation. Said they'd had a bad year. I wrote the check. The gratitude in year 1 was real, I think. My daughter hugged me in the kitchen and called me her hero. My son-in-law bought me a bottle of scotch at Christmas and sat with me watching the Leafs game. Small things, but they meant something. By year 2, the gratitude became expectation. The expectation became entitlement. And the entitlement, by year 3, became something uglier. My son-in-law started having opinions about the house. The furniture was dated. The guest bathroom needed a renovation. The backyard wasn't being used to its potential. I heard this last one while I was watering my tomatoes. The same garden I'd kept for 20 years, that Elaine and I had expanded together the summer before she got sick. He stood on the deck with his coffee and told me it wasn't being used to its potential. Small things accumulated. The television in the living room was changed to his preferred streaming services, and I had to ask to watch the news in my own home. My mail was opened, not read apparently, just sorted. I was asked to keep my morning routine quieter because he worked late and slept in. I was 66 years old in my own house being asked to tiptoe. My friend Neil, we'd worked together at the same accounting firm for 15 years before he retired to Hamilton, came by one afternoon in September, and I walked him around the garden. We sat on the deck and talked. When he left, he said something I couldn't shake. He said, "Norm, you seem like a guest in your own house." His name is Norman, by the way. That's me. I should have said that earlier. The Thanksgiving that changed everything was in October, 3 years after they'd moved in. I had been up since 5:30. Turkey, 14 pounds, into the oven by 6. Stuffing from scratch. My mother's recipe, bread and sage and onion, the kind that takes an hour and a half and fills the whole house with something that smells like every good November of your childhood. Roasted squash, cranberry sauce from real cranberries, pumpkin pie, baked the night before. Nobody helped. My daughter slept until 9. My son-in-law was on his phone in the living room. Theo at least kept me company for an hour, sitting on the counter asking if he could eat the cranberries raw. Guests were coming at 2. His friends from his new business network. 2 couples I'd met once. Not my friends, not family. His guests in my house. I was lifting the casserole dish when he said it. "Get out of the kitchen, Dad. You're embarrassing us." I think what made it land so hard was the us. Not me, us. As if he and my daughter had already discussed this. As if they had decided together that I was the embarrassment. I went to the living room and sat in my chair. My daughter came out 10 minutes later and said softly that maybe I should go for a drive while the guests arrived. Let them settle in. I could come back for dinner. Let them settle in. To my house. I looked at her for a long moment. She wouldn't hold my eye. I stood up. I got my coat from the hook I'd installed in 1999, the same hook where Elaine used to hang her scarf. I put on my shoes. I walked to the front door, and then I stopped, and I turned around. I want to be very clear about what happened next, because I've had people assume I lost my temper. I didn't. My voice was completely calm. That calm came from somewhere very deep and very old, from 40 years of sitting across boardroom tables and delivering bad news to people who didn't want to hear it. I said, "I'm not going for a drive. This is my house, and if anyone is leaving today, it isn't me." My son-in-law came out of the kitchen where he'd apparently taken over. He laughed. Actual laughter, the contemptuous kind. "You're being dramatic," he said. "It's just dinner." "It's my house," I said, "and I'd like you both to consider that very carefully over the next few days." His guests arrived 20 minutes later. I sat at my own dining room table, the one Elaine and I bought at an estate sale in Burlington in 2003, and I was polite and I was quiet, and I watched my son-in-law accept compliments about the food I had cooked for 7 hours. He said we made everything from scratch. He gestured at my daughter. He did not gesture at me. After dinner, while my daughter and his guests were in the living room, I went to my study. I opened my filing cabinet. I pulled out the ledger. I sat at my desk and I added up 3 years of figures I'd been tracking without fully acknowledging why I was tracking them. The total, documented and conservative, was $61,400. Direct cash transfers and checks, $37,400. Estimated additional household cost over the baseline of living alone, $24,000. I was being conservative. A less conservative estimate was closer to $80,000. I wrote the number at the bottom of the last page, underlined it twice, and I put the ledger back in the filing cabinet. Then I called Neil. He arrived the next afternoon. We sat at the kitchen table, my kitchen table, and I told him everything from the beginning. Neil is methodical, the way accountants are methodical. He let me finish before he said anything. "You've been preparing for this without knowing it," he said. He looked at the ledger I'd put on the table between us. "All of this is documented. Every dollar. Then you need a lawyer, not eventually. Monday." I called Margaret Ewan on Monday morning. She was a family and property law solicitor in Oakville, referred by Neil. I'd heard her name in professional circles over the years. She was thorough, and she was unsentimental, which is what I needed. I sat across from her and explained the situation. 3 years of residence, no lease, no rent paid, no formal agreement. My son-in-law's verbal promises to repay. My documentation. She asked me directly, "Do you want them out?" I said yes. Then we served notice. In Ontario, when there's no lease and no rent paid, they're considered occupants, not tenants. The process is different from evicting a tenant. We give written notice to vacate. Reasonable time frame 60 days is standard. She reviewed my ledger and the documentation I'd brought. Bank statements. The canceled checks. An email from my daughter dated 8 months prior, thanking me for letting them stay while they rebuild. Her words, letting them stay. She'd acknowledged in writing that the house was mine and the arrangement was mine to grant or withdraw. "This is useful," Margaret said, tapping the email printout, "if they contest anything." The notice was prepared and delivered by registered mail on November 3rd. 60 days. Out by January 3rd. My daughter called that evening. Her voice was a frequency I hadn't heard since she was a teenager, caught in something she couldn't explain her way out of. "Dad, what is this? What did you do?" "I gave you proper notice," I said, "as is my legal right. You have 60 days. You can't do this. It's almost winter. Where are we supposed to go?" "That's been your question to answer for 3 years," I said. "I suggest you start answering it." My son-in-law called an hour later. His voice was different. Cold, controlled, the way men get when they're calculating rather than feeling. He said they weren't leaving. He said they'd look into their legal rights. He said I'd regret this. I said, "You have 60 days. I'd spend them wisely." The 60 days were not quiet. My son-in-law apparently consulted someone who told him about tenant protections under the Residential Tenancies Act. What that person failed to clarify, or what he failed to absorb, was that the RTA applies to tenants with leases or with rent paid. They had neither. They were occupants at the owner's discretion. The legal ground under him was not ground at all. I know this because Margaret had explained it clearly, and because I'd spent 3 evenings reading the Ontario legislation myself. 40 years in finance. I am not easily confused by documentation. Neil came by on a Thursday in December, bottle of wine, and we sat on the back porch in the cold the way we sometimes do when we need to think clearly. He asked me how I was holding up. "I feel guilty," I said. "Of course you do. That doesn't mean I'm wrong." "No," he said. "It means you're a decent person doing a hard thing." We sat with that for a while. "Theo," I said finally. Neil nodded. He understood. My grandson was 10 now. None of this was his doing. He'd been sleeping in my spare bedroom for 3 years, doing his homework at my kitchen table, learning to skate on the rink. I flooded in the backyard every winter. He called me Grandpa Norm. He still left his shoes directly in the center of the front hallway, no matter how many times I told him not to. I called my daughter separately, without her husband on the line, and I told her that whatever happened between the adults, Theo was always welcome. That I would always make time for him. That nothing I was doing was about him. She cried. That was the first time in months I'd heard anything real from her. January 3rd. They were still in the house. I called Margaret. She filed with the Ontario Superior Court of Justice for an order of recovery of possession. Given the clear circumstances, no lease, no rent, written notice properly served, acknowledgement of ownership and documentation, she was confident. On January 18th, my son-in-law appeared at the door with a woman I didn't recognize. He introduced her as a paralegal. She was holding a folder and trying to look official. He told me they had grounds to stay. That 3 years of residency and contribution to the household established a form of equitable interest, that I couldn't simply remove them. I stepped back and let them in because I'd called Margaret in advance, and she was listening on speaker from my shirt pocket. When he finished, Margaret's voice came from my pocket. "Who am I speaking with?" Silence. "This is Margaret Ewan, solicitor for the homeowner. For your information, equitable interest claims require documented financial contribution to the property's value. Paying nothing for 3 years doesn't establish equitable interest. It establishes residence at the owner's discretion, which has been formally withdrawn. The court filing has been made. I'd advise your client to comply with the notice rather than add a court loss to his situation." The paralegal looked at him. He looked at me. He left without saying anything else. The court order was granted on February 9th. Recovery of possession by February 23rd. They moved out on the 21st. I know because I watched from the upstairs window, not with satisfaction exactly, with something more complicated. My daughter carried boxes to a rental truck. My son-in-law carried the larger things. Theo carried his own backpack and his hockey bag and walked to the truck without looking back at the house. I stood at the window until the truck pulled away. Then I went downstairs and stood in the kitchen for a long time. The locks were changed the next morning. I called a locksmith in Burlington, a small company, cash job, and stood in the front hallway while he worked. 3 doors, new hardware throughout, 2 sets of keys, one for me, one sealed in an envelope in my filing cabinet. When he left, I made coffee, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my ledger to a new page. I held a pen over the paper for a while before I started writing. What I didn't know yet, what I would learn through a combination of Neil's contacts and my own professional instincts, was that my son-in-law's business history was not as clean as presented. His renovation company in Calgary, the one that had supposedly collapsed under COVID pressure, had been under informal complaint review by the Better Business Bureau before it closed. 3 clients claiming work billed but not completed. One of those clients had paid a $14,000 deposit and received nothing. I found this out the way you find things out. When you spend 40 years in accounting, you follow the documents. I requested old financial records from my daughter's time in Calgary, records she'd sent me when I was doing their taxes in year 2, and which I still had in my filing cabinet. Cross-referencing those with the timeline of the company collapse and the deposit complaint told a quiet story. I called an old colleague at CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency. We'd worked overlapping files years ago. I wasn't asking him to do anything. I was asking him, over coffee, whether the kind of irregularities I was describing were something his office would want to know about. He said yes. I sent a letter, not a complaint, technically, but a letter with documentation attached, requesting that the appropriate review process be applied to business filings made by my son-in-law's company between 2018 and 2020. I attached copies of the financial records I had. I signed it with my professional credentials. Chartered Professional Accountant, retired. CRA does not move fast, but it moves surely. By April, my daughter had called me 3 times. The first 2 I let go to voicemail. The third I answered. She was working part-time at a garden center in Mississauga, which I found oddly appropriate. She said things had been very difficult. She said my son-in-law had been receiving correspondence from CRA that was making him frightened and angry. She said he blamed me. He should consider whether he's given them reason, I said. Silence. Amanda. That's her name, my daughter. I realize I haven't said it yet. You knew some of what he'd done. Maybe not all of it, but some. Long silence. I know, she said. Then you understand why I couldn't keep enabling it. The CRA inquiry eventually became an audit. The audit eventually produced a finding of unreported income and improper business deductions totaling $31,000. My son-in-law was assessed back taxes, penalties, and interest. He didn't have the money. He entered a repayment agreement with the agency. It would take years. I filed a civil claim for the $61,400 in June. Margaret handled it efficiently. The documentation was overwhelming. My son-in-law's lawyer, a different one now, someone who did free initial consultations, sent one letter attempting to characterize the money as gifts. Margaret responded with the written records, the email, the verbal commitments my daughter had made in text messages I'd preserved, the ledger. The case was settled before it reached a hearing. My son-in-law signed a consent judgment for $61,400. Given his CRA repayment plan and general financial state, the court established monthly payments of $400 beginning that fall. It would take almost 13 years to collect in full. I am 67. I may not see all of it. That isn't entirely the point. Neil and I talked about this on his back porch in Hamilton one Saturday in July, watching his grandchildren run through the sprinkler in the yard. He asked me if I felt better now that it was resolved. I thought about that honestly. I feel like the house is mine again, I said. I feel like I can breathe in my own kitchen. And Amanda? I looked at the kids in the sprinkler. She had called me on a Sunday in late June just to talk, not to ask for anything. She told me about the garden center, about a customer who taught her something about perennial planting. She told me Theo had made a travel hockey team. She didn't mention her husband. We talked for 40 minutes, and it felt like the first real conversation we'd had in 3 years. We're working on it, I said to Neil. Slowly. What does slowly look like? She's coming for dinner next Thursday. Just her and Theo. Neil smiled and didn't say anything. He's a good friend. He knows when the right move is silence. The dinner was a roast. Theo ate 3 plates and talked the entire time about hockey statistics in a way I could only partially follow but found completely delightful. He left his shoes in the center of the hallway again. I didn't say anything. Amanda washed the dishes without being asked, and when she was done, she stood at the sink looking out the window at the backyard where the garden was coming in. "Your tomatoes are early this year?" she said. "Little warmer than usual," I said. She turned around and looked at me, and I saw my little girl in there somewhere behind everything that had happened. I also saw a woman who had made difficult choices and was starting to understand the cost of them. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "Not for the first time, but I mean it differently now." "I know," I said. "I chose comfort over honesty. I let him treat you like that because it was easier than standing up to him. In your house." She stopped. "I have no excuse for that." "No," I said. "You don't." We stood there a moment. "I'd like to keep having dinner," she said, "if you'd let me." "Thursday works," I said. She smiled, small and careful, the way people smile when they're not sure they've earned it yet. I set the kettle on. Theo called from the living room, asking if I had any of those oatmeal cookies from the tin on the counter. I called back that he could have 2. He had 4. I saw him do it, and I didn't say anything. That night after they left, I sat in my study with a cup of tea and looked at my late wife's photograph on the desk. The one from the Muskoka trip in 2014. Her laughing at something out of frame, her hair blown sideways in the wind off the lake. I'd kept it turned slightly away from me these past few years. I couldn't say exactly when I turned it back. I thought about what I'd learned. Not the legal part, not the documentation, not the leverage. The human part. I had believed that love meant absorbing whatever came. That family meant endless patience, endless resource, endless room. I had confused love with surrender. The people who love you well don't need your surrender. They need your honesty. And sometimes honesty looks like a 60-day notice and the locksmith and a consent judgment filed with the Ontario Superior Court. Sometimes protecting yourself is the most loving thing you can do, for yourself first, and eventually, if they're willing to do the work, for them too. I finished my tea. The house was quiet in a way that felt like mine. I turned off the lamp and went to bed. I still think about the moment I set that casserole dish down, 7 hours of cooking, and I set it down quietly, walked to the hallway, and stood there in my own house feeling like a stranger in it. That's the moment I keep returning to. Not the legal filings, not the court order, not the day the truck pulled away. That moment at the counter, when I finally understood what I'd been allowing. What I've come to understand is that consequences don't appear from nowhere. They grow from choices, slowly the way damage from water does, hidden inside the walls until one day the whole surface buckles. My son-in-law made choices over 3 years, small ones at first. A dismissive comment about the furniture. Taking the remote, opening my mail, each one a test, and each time I said nothing, the next test came a little further. That's not bad luck. That's cause and effect, as honest and ordinary as anything I tracked in 40 years of accounting. But I made choices too. I told myself I was being patient when I was being avoidant. I told myself I was helping family when I was quietly funding disrespect. There's a version of generosity that comes from genuine goodness, and there's a version that comes from not wanting to face a difficult conversation. I've been mixing the two up for a long time, and calling it love. What finally got me moving wasn't anger, it was clarity. And clarity, I've found, requires a particular kind of honesty with yourself. The willingness to look at what's actually in front of you, rather than the version of events you'd prefer to be true. I had the documentation. I'd always had it. What I needed was the courage to use it. That's what I think about when I think about what I did right. Eventually. Not the strategy. Not the legal maneuvering. The moment I decided that protecting my own home was not something to be ashamed of. That standing up for myself was not cruelty. That a person can love their daughter and still hand her the consequences of her choices. Those two things don't cancel each other out. I had to learn that at 66 years old, sitting at my own kitchen table with a ledger I'd been keeping for 3 years without fully admitting why, Amanda is figuring out who she is now, slowly and honestly, in a way I don't think she would have if I'd kept absorbing everything quietly. Theo leaves his shoes in the center of the hallway and eats 4 cookies when I say 2, and I don't say anything, because some things are worth exactly nothing as problems. Neil comes by on Thursdays and we sit on the porch and sometimes we don't say much at all. The house is mine again. The quiet in it is mine. And I've learned that knowing your own worth, really knowing it, not just believing it in theory, sometimes costs something before it gives anything back. It cost me a hard winter and a longer road back to my daughter. I'd pay it again.